Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo Radical Engagements. We are in the final countdown of this 3-year series that I've done on reading text. Like I said, I'm going to replace it with something more like what I do on Mondays. But I will incorporate more text and do more comparisons and try to explicate by contrast as opposed to line by line reading. Since I recorded last one, some people told me that this was not a patronizing series. This was basically Talmudic commentary for the left. And I was like, well, not totally sure that that's always going to be most appreciated by people. Doesn't mean, however, that I won't ever do it again. Anyway, we're in chapter 1 of Lars Lih's When We Discovered What Is to Be Done in Context, which is in section 1 of the Marxist Unity Group Reader, and this is our 7th episode. We are probably about 2/3 through this text. We just left off with Kautsky invoking dignity, and we'll get back to that now. Now, I've read this paragraph before, but since we go directly into a long quote, I figure the context would be useful. Kautsky's mention of prestige and human dignity point to larger themes, and I've talked about this too later. Communists avoid human dignity or workers' dignity even. Faced with the formidable self-righteousness of Victorian bourgeois civilization, a worker political party faced with the life and death problem of protecting what we might now call worker self-esteem. Kautsky argued that scientific socialism provided a goal that was superior in its sweep and generosity of the vision of the bourgeois parties. Not only that, it also provided a necessary confidence that could and would be achieved. The only firm sense of the final goal could give the worker self-respect and the respect of other classes. The final goal was the only thing that made a unified nationwide class party even feasible. I mean, sure. Quote, what gives the political party cohesion, especially if, like the socialist parties, it has a great historical task to fulfill, is the final goal. There will always be differences of opinion within the party, and sometimes these differences reach disquieting intensity. But the more the great common goals really live in the awareness of the party members, the less easily will these internal disputes cause party splits. And I think this is actually somewhat true, even though I also think it's somewhat lofty. The final goal is not just words displayed on a banner, it's an obligation of learning to grasp the big picture, as Kautsky wrote in 1908. Quote from Kautsky. Today, in a society whose market embraced the entire world, a society which is in the process of constant transformation of industrial and social revolution, in which workers are organizing themselves into an army of millions and the capitalists are accumulating billions in money, it is impossible for a rising class, a class that cannot content itself with the retention of the status quo, and thus is obliged to aim at complete reconstruction of society, to conduct this class struggle intelligently and successfully by a mere resort to plain common sense and to the detailed work of practical men. It becomes a necessity for each combatant to broaden his horizon through scientific understanding, to grasp the operation of great social forces in time and space, not in order to abolish the work in detail or even regulate it to the background, but in order to align it in a definitive relation with the social process as a whole. To sum up Kautsky here, the worker has a duty to be intelligent. Also, to put Lionel Trilling in Kautsky's mouth. Nonetheless, the dire consequences of the absence of a final goal are exemplified by the fate of the English workers, or by business unions today. I might add that this is me injecting that. The power of individual trade unions was hardly compensation for the resulting known-ness of spirit that caused the worker aristocrats, who should have been champions of the masses, to act instead as their oppressors. I'm sure about that, although I will say there's a co-management model in unionization that has become dominant that makes this somewhat inevitable. But I mean, I get Kautsky and or Lars Lih's point here. Even more striking was the political helplessness of even the economically powerful workers. Writing in 1902 and citing the research of Beatrice and Sidney Webb, you know Beatrice Webb, I read her books as a kid. She wrote about a certain Peter Rabbit. Kotsky stated that the impact of workers on British politics was in fact steadily decreasing. Quote, even the latest scourging by their opponents have not served to rouse the proletariat of England. They remain dumb even when their unions are rendered powerless. Dumb with their bread is more costly. Dumb here means quiet, by the way. It doesn't mean stupid. It means silent. The English workers today stand lower as a political factor than the workers of the most economically backwards and least politically free country in Europe, Russia. It is their thriving revolutionary awareness that gives Russian workers their great practical strength. It is the renunciation of revolution, the narrowing of interest to the interest of the moment, the so-called realpolitik, that has made the English workers a nullity in actual politics. If only Jacobin magazine would actually listen to this. Actually, it's not fair. Some of them do, but some of them don't. If inspiring the final goal was so vital for effective worker class influence, the mandate for social democrats is clear. It is, quote Kotsky, the duty of every man who's made the advancement of the proletariat his life work to oppose this tendency towards spiritual stagnation and stupidity. Now, we are talking about stupidity. And to direct the attention of proletarians to a great point of view, to large prospects, to worthy goals. Hence the importance of the minimum maximum program. The maximum program is the worthy goals. The minimum program is what you need to do it and what reforms you might demand. This comment leads us to one final aspect of Kotsky's outlook. The insistence not only on the proletariat's, but also on social democracy's own high and inspiring mission. Just as the social democratic narrative gave strength to the workers to fight against the seemingly hopeless odds, it gave strength to the social democratic activists who devoted themselves to their Kleinarbeit, the seeming insignificant detail work needed to run an impressive party machinery. Small work. Kleinarbeit, small work. All right, anyway. Quote, to lead the economic and political class struggle, to carry out enthusiastically one's small duties, but fill them with the thoughts of a wide-encompassing socialism, to bring together those means, the organization and the activities of the proletariat in a unified and harmonious way into the whole, but into a massive whole that rises up ever more irresistible. That is what Marx and Engels taught was the task of everyone, whether proletariat or not, who adopts a viewpoint of the proletariat and wishes to liberate it. The dual meaning of proletarianization in the Communist Manifesto. One way it means people who are forced into a position like the proletariat, like parts of the petty bourgeoisie that unfortunately has gone in and out of actually happening in the economy, but nonetheless it has happened at certain points. Professionals too. And then as professionals are literally proletarianized, i.e. forced into labor, aristocratic wage labor, but wage labor nonetheless. The rational core of the PMC, as I like to say it, is there is labor aristocracy, Virginia, and it's in the professions that have been proletarianized and continue to be proletarianized and are more proletarianized now than they were in the past. While also certain things that were priorly proletarianized have been backdoor capitalized through their payments in stock, making them joint holders of the company. Anyway, a lot of the stuff that seems mystified to people and that they need to come up with complicated vocabulary for, maybe because labor aristocrat is an alienating phrase. I get it. It sounds ancient. Leads them to try to invent new categories where old ones actually explain things more clearly. We end this section with the final words of Kotsky's Path to Power. I have always translated that as Road to Power, but I'm going to trust Lars Lih on this. Written in 1909 and much admired by Lenin. This is the exalted rhetoric that rarely makes it into secondary count, yet is a vital part of the context for a book like What is to be Done, unquote. Already the elite of the proletariat forms the strongest, most far-sighted, most selfless, and boldest stratum, although elite or advanced is often used by Marx and Kotsky in a way that makes it unclear what elite or advanced means, like elite and advanced to what? The one united in the free organizations of the nations of European culture. And in the same way, the proletariat will, in and through struggle, take up into itself the most selfless and far-sighted elements of all classes. It will organize and educate in its own bosom even its own most backward elements and fill them with the joy and hope and insight. its elite will rise up the height of culture, making it capable of leading the immense economic transformation that will finally, throughout the whole world, put an end to the miseries that arise out of slavery, exploitation, and ignorance. Happy are they who called to take part in the high struggle in this glorious victory. Leadership of the people, the hegemony scenario. Now, I think this is a technically different section, but I think we actually probably have time to go into it. So let's go into it. Social democracy, Kotsky tells us, has a tendency to become more and more a national party. That a Volksparty, in the sense that it is representation not only of industrial wage laborers, industrial laborers being a particular second international bugbear, as opposed to service workers, but of all laboring and exploited strata, and therefore a great majority of the population that is commonly known as the folk. Remember, V is F. I don't know why, when translating that, you don't just translate that into folk. I guess, anyway, I guess there's different connotations in English, but it's literally the same word. It's even pronounced the same way. You just spell it differently because spelling conventions. All right. This feature of the social democratic narrative was overwhelmingly important for Russian social democracy. Social democracy will also be able to lead to the non-industrial laboring classes because socialism is the interest of all laboring classes. So laboring classes can be class collaborative, but only within the laboring classes, except sometimes when you have to deal with large peasants or something. This becomes a big deal later on, but we're not going to talk about it right now. All right. But this long-term perspective does not exhaust the potential for the leadership of the folk in the here and now. Precisely because social democracy is a merger of socialism and the worker movement, is not restricted to preaching socialism and defending worker interest. Quote, social democracy cannot defend exclusively the interests of the proletariat. Its historical mission is to participate in social evolution in the domain in which it can act and take in its hand the cause of the exploited and the oppressed. Yeah, right-wing tailist workerism doesn't do this, and that's why it sucks. I don't really know what else to tell you. As popular as it comes out, every socialist going all the way back to Marx and Engels has warned that that's a problem, and a lot of workers' movement has warned that it's a problem too. Anyway, the social democracy encourages the proletariat to see itself as the sworn enemy of exploitation or oppression in whatever form it may take. It is the champion, Vorkämpfer, of all exploited and oppressed. Again, why are you not translated? What's with the random German word? Does Vorkämpfer have a different connotation than champion? I don't think it does. Anyway, I have a good working knowledge of German. What this means in concrete terms is that social democracy can defend the present day acknowledged interests of all laboring classes better than any other party because of the special position of the workers and the special knowledge of the socialist. That's why. At least in theory. I don't know if it's actually worked out that way, but I've said that many times through these readings. These interests are enshrined in the so-called minimum program. The logic of the minimum program would be easier to grasp if it was called the maximum program. That is to be the maximum achieved prior to proletarian rule. I think this minimum / transitional program, a lot of the minimum and transitional programs end up being the same thing. But anyway, conversely, the logic of the so-called minimum program is that it contains the minimum that has to be realistically achievable before the worker class is justifying taking power. For example, in the United States, that would be the repeal of Taft-Hartley. Right? Minimum indeed seems a misleading epithet for the set of measures that would have entailed a vast and social transformation of Imperial Germany. Full representative democracy, full political liberties, cough, cough. I know you guys don't like that, but it actually is part of all of the internationals call. Religious tolerance and a penchant for secularism. That actually does need to be talked about. But in general, religious tolerance is good. Socialized medicine, progressive tax. Although I will say that Marx was a little bit more iffy on whether or not we should support a progressive tax in certain moments. In fact, there are times in Marxist letters he said we shouldn't support taxing the working class at all because it would empower their oppressors. But anyway, labor protection laws, This list also shows how justified the SPD was in regarding itself as the principal voice of ethical decency of the modernism in Imperial Germany. Are, why progressivism and socialism have never really been able to divorce, even though socialism is definitely the older partner here. According to Kotsky, some of these demands can only be championed by an anti-capitalist party. I mean, some of them. Socialized medicine being one, labor protection laws being another. The rest can be championed by bourgeois parties and were, as Marx points out in the Goethe critique, something that I think Lars Lih is actually kind of weak on discussing. I've talked about that before. According to Kotsky, some of these demands can only be championed by the anti-capitalist parties. Others are officially part of the program of bourgeois democracy. Yes, it is. That is, those in the sections of the middle class that are actively, or at least publicly, interested in democratic transformation. But this is a crucial observation, that even bourgeois democratic demands will only be championed by a party with as much energy as social democracy. Meaning you got to have energy to win. See, the Democrats in the United States who supposedly are championing these things, and how lackluster and limp noodled they all are. All right. Along with social democracy's role as a champion of the interest of all laboring classes as a whole, is the influence that results as the proletarian way of life becomes more a model for other classes. I have cited Kotsky on this point, but I have a document of this aspect of the social democratic narrative with the works written in 1898 by Parvus, I don't know, a Russian-born social democratic activist who was at the time a very influential spokesman of the SPD left. The overwhelming majority of the population are in industry, trade, etc. I mean, they weren't, but they were hoping they were going to be. These are therefore the people who determine the economic character of the country. This is not merely a matter of numerical superiority. It means that this general industrial urban population with its interests, conflicts, views, demands, dominates the historical character of Germany, brings all other things under its sway, shapes them in its own likeliness, and makes them dependent upon itself, and inevitably establishes its moral hegemony over them by the vast tide of public opinion that it generates. The readers will notice that Parvus used the word hegemony in the passage just quoted. This allows a nice segue nicely to the political strategy labeled hegemony by the Russian Social Democrats, which is where Gramsci got it, if you've ever wondered. Our interest is more than the logic of this political strategy than the word used to label it. For a word history of hegemony, see the appendix to this chapter, which we're not going to do because it's not in this reader, I don't think. Hegemony was used to describe the social democratic hopes for interclass leadership in the Russian context. The core idea was that hegemony strategy is that the Russian proletariat was the only force capable of leading the bourgeois democratic revolution that would overthrow the Tsar. People like Daniel Delone hated this, by the way, because they said it confused the stages of revolution. As Plekhanov put it in 1889, the Russian Revolution, Plekhanov means the anti-Tsarist revolution, will triumph as a revolution of the worker class, or it will not triumph at all. See 1905, I guess. This strategy has struck many as surprising, even paradoxical, one for Marxists to adopt. According to the Marxist schema, it is said, and Daniel de Leon, as I mentioned, the American Marxist sure as hell believed it, that the bourgeois revolution is carried out by the bourgeoisie. Otherwise, why labor in a bourgeois revolution while the proletariat carries out a socialist revolution at a later date? I want to show here is that hegemony strategy follows, perhaps with a natural necessity. I like that perhaps is doing a lot of work here, Lars, from the accepted premise of social democratic thinking that I already described it. In fact, the appropriate conclusions from these premises already drawn by Kotsky in his book on parliamentarianism in 1893. Premise number one, it is political freedom, it's absolute necessity for social democracy. See Hal Draper's writing on this, see Neil Harding's writing on this, see a bunch of people's writing on this. For its premise, it follows that in the countries where only pretend a parliamentary regime, oh good God, shine constitutionalismus. Another weighty task, which I guess would mean fake constitutionalism. Another weighty task falls to the proletariat, the conquest of a generally parliamentary machine. You know, Marxist Unity Group would actually say we live in a pretend congressional machine. A shine constitutionalism was a fake-ass constitutionalism, particularly today. All right. Perhaps before the rise of social democracy, a revolution could really believe that the parliamentary regime would be the only benefit the elite and not the people. I guess this is an excuse for LaSalle or Bordiga or a lot of people. Well, you can't really excuse Bordiga from it. But anyway, today it becomes clearer that every day the struggle for the proletarian political power takes form, at least in the east of Europe, and the struggle of a parliamentary machine against absolutism and militarism. Flip those in the actual text, but I said pretty much the same thing. Premise number 2 is that the people as a whole also have an interest in political freedom that will protect them from the abuse of power, like les deux. Although I will say both liberals and leftists in America are highly inconsistent on this point. But some of the people who pointed out that they were highly inconsistent on this point, because all of a sudden they're like kissing the ass of someone want to be, I guess, for dialectical reasons, whatever. Of course, social democracy is the force that will most effectively use political freedom to fight abuses. Our parliamentary system, even such as we should servile one as Austria, ensures that a single inflexible and brave individual can throw the glare of publicity on abuses and set a certain limit to arbitrary action. Parliament provides a tribune from whose heights the accusers of the present-day society can speak to the entire people. Premise number 3 is that the bourgeois' interest in political freedom goes down to the proletariat's interest as it goes up. I mean, this we see in the Bruckner. The bourgeoisie becomes less and less attached to its ideals when its property is threatened. It also has fractions among itself and fight each other just as hard as they fight not just as hard, but almost as hard as they fight the underclass, depending. The underclasses, the laboring classes, call it what you will. The bourgeoisie certainly would not mind having political freedom for themselves, and they have no qualms about enlisting the proletariat to help get those freedoms, as long as the bourgeoisie can be sure that the proletariat will not use them in a dangerous way. Like with the internet and shit. Today, perhaps the proletariat can simply be banned from political participation, as France after 1830, or perhaps the bourgeoisie feels unthreatened by a docile proletariat, as in England. But the bourgeoisie has begun to notice correctly that it can no longer exploit the revolutionary services of the proletariat in that way. In fact, the evident success of social democracy makes political freedom itself less attractive. For German social democrats, it was axiomatic that the cowardly bourgeoisie had betrayed their own cause after 1848. As Kirkup recounts, one quote from Kirkup, it is a standing charge brought against the German liberalism by social democrats that it has never led the progressive forces against reaction with any degree of courage or resolution. And they don't hear today either. They maintain that in the revolutionary struggles of 1848, the German liberals never trusted the working class, that when the choice came to be made between reaction and a strenuous democratic policy supported by the proletariat, they preferred to transact with reaction and so committed treason on the sacred cause of progress. Quote, within a quote, the treason of the bourgeoisie, or I like to call it the abdication of bourgeoisie, which is the next term, the abdication by the bourgeoisie of its historic place at the head of the democratic movement. These phrases sum up the worst accusations by social democrats against the German middle class. And so me to everyone else today, although I would say progress is a lot harder to believe of in the unilateral way and a Whiggish way that they often did in the 19th century. But let's continue. Kautsky generalized the failure of the German bourgeoisie with the following epigram. In fact, the European bourgeoisie east of the Rhine has become so weak and so cowardly that in all likelihood the regime of the saber and of bureaucracy cannot be broken until the proletariat is in the position to conquer political power, so that the fall of absolutist militarism will lead directly to the seizure of political power by the proletariat, which, it didn't happen. Well, sort of, kind of did and then failed. But, good on you, I guess. But the sort of kind of was the German revolutions of 1917, 1918 didn't go anywhere. And also the Mexican Revolution that did go somewhere and then didn't. We can name them if we want to. Put all these premises together and we see social democracy, the party of class war proletariat, is the very fact of the most solid support of democratic aspirations and much more reliable support than the bourgeois democrats themselves. The social democratic proletariat was the most reliable supporter of democracy because it saw democracy not as an end in itself, but as a means, an absolutely vital means, Social democracy would love democracy less, loved it not socialism more. The Russians may have been the first to use the word hegemony to describe proletarian leadership in the bourgeois revolution, but the strategy itself was implacably social democratic. Although, again, I've already said that as early as 1905, there were Marxists who criticized this as confused. See Daniel De Leon in America and his Socialist Equity Party, which I don't think, I think it actually existed by that point. Anyway, the basic idea was simply this: the bourgeois political freedoms were much too important to be left to the bourgeoisie. I still think that, by the way. The bourgeoisie would try to exploit the revolutionary service of the proletariat to get as much for themselves and as little for the laboring classes as possible. Which, by the way, when people try to compare the bourgeois revolution with the workers' class revolution and say that like the revolution is just one revolution and this is all going to be clean, and it's just bourgeois culture manifested to the worker, or whatever dumb bullshit they're saying to justify this clear deviation from all socialist historical understanding, they're also trying to get you to side with people who will betray you really quickly. A proletariat led by social democracy would instead lead the whole people to ensure the most extensive democratic constitution available. Political freedom made social democracy possible, and therefore it was the duty of social democracy to make political freedom possible. According to the hegemony scenario, social democracy assumed leadership not just of the worker movement of the proletariat, but the people. Das Volk, the Narod, or Narodniki, the people is the folk. Das Volk, or the Narod, as a whole. Thus, we find ourselves now in the outer circles of the spread of awareness. The battle for leadership is more difficult in these outer circles. I mean, I actually think workers' politics, and I'm a critiquer of workerism, but I think when people go to populism, they're actually making a less populist stance than just doing workers' reformism, which I think is workers' reformism is insufficient. But if it was actually reform and not piecemeal policy, it would probably be a little better. There is more incomprehension, vacillation, and even hostility. The resulting complex set of expectations is brought out in the passage by Kautsky written in the 1920s. This is Kautsky when I'm not as much of a fan of him, but anyway. As the mass economic importance and the intelligence and the industrial proletariat grow, it quit growing in the middle of the 20th century, though, bro. So does the attraction exerted by the proletariat and the strata of the people who do not entirely belong to it, but close to it with the respect of their standard of living and their economic relations. The attraction becomes stronger the greater the intellectual, organizational independence and unity of the proletariat are, which by not having the independence and unity of the proletariat has no attractiveness to anyone else, does it? Anyway, the classes in society are not in reality not so rigorously distinct as they have to be in theory. This is very true, and I'm glad Kautsky realized it even back then, because people try to make this much harder and more obvious than it is. Thus, there are numerous intermediate grades between the class of wage laborers and other working classes, peasants and artisans, and the petty trades, just as there are between them and the intellectuals, vacillating between the proletariat and capital, individual members, and even the whole of these groups of classes and strata decide more in favor of or against the proletariat, depending on the particular influences, historical situations, and economic constellations. That doesn't actually say that much. I just want to point that out there. So the middle tier classes vacillate depending on conditions. That's what that's saying. And yeah, that's true. Which conditions and how can we be predictable? A part of the peasants, the petty bourgeois, and the intellectuals can become ever more bitterly antagonistic to the proletariat. That's definitely true. A constantly growing part, especially of the poor strata, will be gone to the proletariat and make proletarian cause their own. I mean, I think that's also true, particularly of the intellectuals, aka the professionals. In this way, too, the mass army grows that marches under the proletarian banner. Yeah, so quit bitching about PMC when you need them. Like, you got to control them. You cannot let them dominate your movement, and that is a real problem. The labor aristocratic professionals will dominate your movement and ruin everything, but you need them. You need them both in numbers and in expertise. I would love not to need coders and not need Ivy League intellectuals for what I do as a former blue collar person, but clearly I need them, even if I have risen this far by self-study. and formal education. All right, we're going to come back and pick up on social democracy as a good news, because that's where I would like probably rant the most. Protect your peace.